Hey, so welcome back, everyone, to our third workshop session for this afternoon. We have Ming and Mako Nagasawa, who will lead a session titled Kingdom Values Driven Parenting. And we will follow the same format, 45 minutes for Ming and Mako to do their thing, 15 minutes or so for Q&A, and then we will move over to the virtual lounge and so forth. Before I turn it over to Ming and Mako, let me just introduce them briefly here. Ming Nagasawa received a MSW from Boston College in 2008, went to Boston College, has been a licensed independent, well, I was going to say a couple of things about BC, but we'll hold off on that. Has been a licensed independent clinical social worker and therapist for over a decade. Prior to that, she worked in a community-based mental health and family stabilization program. Ming enjoys gardening and helped launch a community garden in the neighborhood in 2005. She served in campus ministry with University Christian Fellowship from 1992 to 2000. Mako received his MTS from Holy Cross Greek Orthodox Seminary in 2019. That's in Newton or Brookline, is it? Brookline? Okay.
Yep.
Is the director of the Anastasia Center for Christian Education and Ministry, which proclaims the restorative justice of God and the healing atonement of Jesus. Mako did campus ministry from 2001 and 2014 with InterVarsity Christian Fellowship and worked at Intel Corporation before that. He is the author of a number of pieces, and I will just share with you two. He's the author of Christmas Irenaeus, How Jesus' Incarnation Honors Creation, the Human Body, and the Human Story. That was published in 2023, and then published in 2021, Abortion Policy and Christian Social Ethics in the United States. If you haven't figured this out by now, Ming and Mako are husband and wife, and their two children, ages 23 and 21, grown children, God bless you both, have lived among friends in a Christian intentional community house in Dorchester, Massachusetts since 2000. Sorry, my Boston accent is not working anymore. I can't say that. Dorchester, yeah, I'm not going to talk. They worship at Neighborhood Church of Dorchester, where Mako serves on the elder team. They have been foster parents for almost 7 years. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here. It's nice to do this workshop following Greg and Jen, and there maybe will be a little bit of overlap, but hopefully the overlap will be helpful and reinforcing. The picture that we're showing is one of our recent Christmases that we shared in our triple decker where we live in Dorchester. Thinking about this topic of race and discipleship for this workshop, for me, where my mind immediately went to was all the treasures of following Jesus in communities that genuinely are trying to take our various cultural contexts and legacy seriously, especially since we do live in a predominantly BIPOC neighborhood and community, and our church has centered itself in the prophetic tradition of the Black church, and that's leadership that we've taken really seriously. And my feeling of the treasures of living in this kind of cultural community and choosing it is how much we've been able to appreciate more deeply, Mako and I ourselves appreciate more deeply and genuinely our own cultural legacies of being Chinese American and Japanese American, while also getting to receive from and enjoy the riches of our friends, and also experience that all of us are being together, rescued by Jesus, including from various cultural idolatries and blind spots. I thought I would reflect for a couple of minutes on my experience as a counselor Um, and as a counselor with my Asian American clients, even though it risks being a cliche, it's still really important for us to spend time reflecting on the sacrificial love that they show us through all the things that have been emphasized throughout this conference. The background of my own parents' stories. At the background was always their physical escape from war and deprivation, family estrangement and secrecy because of the communist nationalist civil war and their history, all the way through their anxieties of immigration and disorientation. And reflecting back on how much love and loyalty is reflected in this sacrifice through trauma is very often and has been part of my own healing journey. But of course, often my clients are also there to see me because of the felt vacuum that they experience because their family culture didn't or hasn't been able to communicate their inherent worth as a child or as a human being apart from performance outcomes. Um, their families didn't value clear verbal affirmation. And as we know, for many of us, certainly for many of my clients, this has directly played into spirals of anxiety and depression and performance orientation. And as we know, this is particularly painful in the context or in relief from a mainstream American culture that really values verbal facility and ease, warmth and affirmation, and feeling that it doesn't um, always come as naturally to some of us. Um, Many of my clients describe watching Gilmore Girls or some other kind of mainstream TV show about family, and in watching the TV program, yearning for the relational or verbal affirmation that they saw portrayed there, and grieve that instead, what often was emphasized in our families of origin as verbally spoken was shaming or comparing or using criticizing language. And in that context, I find that it's helpful for me to remember with my clients that even shaming, um, which in our context in the United States, we have come to reflexively recoil from it as automatically toxic, which there are a lot of downsides to shaming. But it is important to remember that even shaming can serve an original and sometimes even loving purpose. Um, for example, I think it's helpful to remember that shaming is a fast and efficient way to get results from ourselves and those we're trying to protect. And when you're trying to survive war, famine, or other kinds of scarcity, fast and efficient for survival can make sense. Um, and then, of course, many of our societies have over the millennia turned that shaming for survival from the blunt tool that it is and crafted it into finely tuned obligations and requirements, spoken, unspoken, beautiful, and treacherous at the same time. Um, and it's in this context, this mixed cultural landscape, that we remember the gospel enters in, with God directly breaking in and showing and speaking his love to us, directly cutting across both the love, the sacrifice, the trauma, the blunt instruments. Um, and one of the most notable parts of the gospel, the most foundational ones, of course, is that God cares about our whole being, our body, our mind, our soul, our spirit. Yeah, all the different aspects that Jennifer highlighted in the earlier workshop. He cares about all of those parts of us. He sees us into eternity, and he himself is our completion. So he rescues us from pure survival, pure outcome, and also pure performance orientation. And also in this context, God both acts and speaks love to us. So the gospel is all about in the beginning is the word. God speaks creation and us, our very beings, into being. God proclaims his love through words. You are my beloved, and through his sacrifice for us. Um, and as many of us, most of us here, are here because the gospel has emotionally rescued, not just spiritually, but emotionally rescued us. Because God speaks his inherent value to us, to our core, and we have received it in this way. We've received the act of redemption that God has given us through Jesus' incarnation, his death, and his resurrection. Um, and for me, it's a continuous sense of rescue, um, as the gospel continues to enter into my tendency to use the blunt instruments of outcome orientation, and shaming on myself and others. And instead, I get to see the redemption of my parents, my family of origin, my culture of origins, uh, the sacrifice, the love, the loyalty, endurance, discipline, all of the good qualities. I get to see it behind and sometimes amongst the blunt instruments. Um, and it's a continuous process. Even when I first found out I was pregnant with our first child, I had to immediately, even maybe within the first moments or days of realizing, of knowing that I was pregnant, I had to immediately recognize and resist the internal temptation to focus on all of my imagined glorious outcome, that my kid was gonna that I imagined for them, and all the ways that I immediately imagined I was going to vicariously live through all the things they would get to experience that I didn't experience so easily. And from the moment of recognition, I had to remember that I needed to pull myself back together with Jesus, to stay in the process, moment by moment. This is going to be stage by stage, and I'm going to have to let my children's lives unfold with Jesus. And I have to resist the temptation to be controlling from the outset. As it turns out, I'm grateful that God, put his finger there, clearly, because even as we continue to relate to our teenage and adult kids, who are not making all the choices that I wish they would make, I have to continue to release this process to Jesus. I have found that it is, encouraging, to do it with friends and mentors from all backgrounds, ethnic, racial, cultural, class backgrounds, because at this point, our kids' strengths and their struggles are so diverse, um, partially just because of personality and who we are, partially because of backgrounds. The desired outcomes coming from all our cultures also aren't as monolithic. So it becomes more obvious that we can't stay in a controlling mindset. And it helps us to come back to figure out how best to love. Another example for me of the treasure of, being in a multiracial, multi-ethnic setting, is for me speaking, like many of us, speaking love wasn't a felt strength of my family of origin, and I did find it in the gospel, um, but it's still not an intuitive strength for me. So receiving it and having it modeled, from my friend, for whom it comes more naturally, maybe because of personality, also culture, is a key part of my continued emotional, spiritual development. So all of this is me saying that at a really basic level, I love being an Asian American Christian living in a multicultural context in this time, because it allows me to live in the nexus of a felt redemption for which I'm grateful. And it's through this lens that we're reflecting with you all on today, um, some of what we have most wanted to experience as the redemption of our own cultural heritages with our kids.
Okay, so these are some of the things that we'll talk about today. How do we think about authority in parenting? And we're talking about parenting because I think similar to Jen and her husband Kevin's experience, parenting really uh, forces us to crystallize which values we really want to pass down, other people to inherit from us. And so this question of whose authority is primary, and then we'll talk about how do we motivate our kids using intrinsic versus extrinsic motivations, educating our kids, what is the importance of learning, and we'll talk about our paradigm has been missionaries versus capitalist competitors. We'll talk about the examples of partnership that we have experienced from our kids, namely in their care for their grandparents rather, and then disappointment as parents and how do we handle that. Okay, so how do we think about Christ's authority? Let me back up a little bit and say I think I was a college student when a mentor of mine explained, who is white American, explained some of his observations and offered them to me to comment on stereotyped white American parent-child relationships and second-generation Asian American relationships. And so he drew two lines, being nerdy. I really enjoyed this. There on the x-axis, you could see the age of the child, from 1 to about 30 or something. And then the authority in the child's life going from 0 to 100. And the blue line represents the parent's authority. So, of course, when the child is young, who makes all the decisions about who who the kid's friends are going to be? What are they going to wear? So parents, I know we sometimes feel like we don't have all the authority, but for the sake of simplicity, we do. And then the red line represents the child's authority. So, the authority of the child over his or her own life. And at some point, those lines cross at around age 16 in a stereotyped, white American family. And maybe it's the time where the child gets a driver's license, and then all this fighting happens about how far can you go. But by the time you get to college and finish college, a child is pretty much 100% in charge of their own decisions. And, a lot of my white friends have said things like their parents have said to them, well, I do not want to be responsible for your choices. You are responsible for your happiness. We have opinions, but that's how it goes. And I said, that's really different, because I would draw my graph like this, where my parents really, this is kind of the Confucian model of a hierarchical relationship, where at age 16, I wanted to push my line higher. And if it was just up to my parents and me, then they would have said, nope, like, you cannot drive down from LA to San Diego without telling us. At age 18, 19, I wanted to study education and think about being a teacher, principal, policymaker in education. And if it were just up to us, my parents would have said, no, you're going to study what we want you to study. And, later in life, when Ming and I got married, I moved across the country. We, lived in community, which my mom especially didn't like. When our daughter was born and we named her Zoe, my mom didn't like that name. So, and if it was just like between my mom and me, those lines would never cross. And so the thought that I had as I looked at these graphs was, at some point as a parent, I really want to parent towards the kingdom. There is something true, I think, about those lines crossing, about about our authority as parents over our children decreasing, and Jesus's authority, or rather, our kids being able to choose Jesus's authority, being really important. And so we'll illustrate that in different ways. The reason I say that, because I think it is a little sensitive, or, a bit of a head scratcher. Am I just kind of preferring the white American model? I don't think so. I think because of Genesis 2 and 1 Corinthians 6 and 7, I'll just quickly go through that. You may be asking why? Why Genesis 2? That's the thing about Adam and Eve. And yes, it is true. It is about marriage. And it is also true that it's not that we assume that our children will get married, but what it is, what strikes me about this is that Genesis 2 says, a man will leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife. I think in all ancient cultures that I know of, it's more true. It is true that a woman will leave her father and mother and join her husband as the lowest ranking member of his family. As far as I can tell, all ancient cultures would have said that. Even modern Japanese culture today, that was a bit of my mom's experience when she married my dad and kind of into my dad's family. She described it as her mother-in-law, my grandma kind of treated her like a slave at times, her own words. So Genesis 2 is really revolutionary by the sense of every new married couple becomes equal to their parents, to their families of origin in terms of the priorities that they set for each other, and that marriage takes priority even over your family of origin. I think then that what that means as people nurture their children to maturity has got to be impacted by that vision. And in the New Testament, we become one with Christ. He is the leading authority. So in 1 Corinthians 6, Paul says, "Do you not know you've been bought with a price? Your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit, for Christ to shine out his life and love through you." And then in chapter 7, the application of that principle is be very careful of giving authority to other people, especially over the use of your body, even marriage. And that's where the famous passage about singleness that makes us all uncomfortable comes from. Paul is saying, yeah, I do wish that you all could be single if you could handle it. And I suppose if that was all your calling, but marriage is still good. But even so, those who are married, he says in verse 29, should be as though they were not, which is a fascinating statement. The implication is Jesus, the mission of Jesus, the family of God, the extended family of God has to take priority. We are not to have a narcissistic marriage. And by extension, we're not to have a kind of narcissistic, hierarchical family relationship with our kids either. We train them to give Jesus authority directly over them. So I hope that makes sense. You could drop things into the chat and we can talk about that later. I'm going to talk about motivating kids, intrinsic versus extrinsic motivations. When our son John was 14, he asked if he could quit playing piano. So yes, we had our kids play piano. So Ming said yes to that question, and I said no. And I want to explain why. I was a competitive swimmer when I was a kid for 10 years. And, there's an easy learning curve to that. And then there's a hard learning curve, right? And I think almost every activity is that way, whether it be sports or arts, music, academics, faith. I think the life of faith is there's kind of an easy part of the learning curve and there's a hard part of the learning curve. And for me, I really wanted my kids to experience what it's like to push through the hard part of the learning curve, even when there was frustration involved and things. And so, I told our son John, it is not that I want you to be the greatest piano player in the world. You don't have to be that. And by the way, there were a whole bunch of other activities and experiences that Ming and I exposed our kids to. And we, we watched what they liked, what they kind of gravitated toward, what seemed natural for them. And we enjoyed music as a family, singing, we like musicals, I play guitar. But then, after 8 years of playing piano, John hit these hard classical pieces that didn't come naturally to him. And he is naturally gifted. And that was part of the flip side of, the kind of the curse of natural giftedness. He didn't have to work hard to achieve a certain level of proficiency. And I told him, look, I just want you to have this experience of pushing through the hard learning curve part, because once you do, you will enjoy it. You will enjoy the feeling even of pushing yourself. That was true of me in sports, in my experience. If those of you who do things like running, there's that feeling of my body is responding to the way I'm pushing it in a healthy way, and I enjoy that feeling. And for a month, John would practice because I told him to, and he would get frustrated when he hit the hard parts. But after a month, he was able to play those pieces. And he also heard piano pieces on anime that he wanted to play. He wanted to learn jazz. And then he started playing for his high school's gospel choir. Now he plays for our church's worship team. Now, I give that illustration as an example of pursuing persevering joy, not external outcomes, but internal experiences and internal character qualities. When our daughter Zoe hit 14 and she asked to quit piano, we said yes, because for her, her passion was writing and her challenge was writing also. She's a junior at Harvard now, and she still likes to run some of her essays by me. And so one of the things I think that is helpful that to reflect on is what is an intrinsic character outcome that we want, that we shoot for our kids, as we call them into partnership with us, versus an external outcome. And so one thing I really appreciate about my wife Ming is how much she stressed having a work ethic, developing a work ethic, because that is internal. So here are some things for us to think about together. You could think about it in your own hand. Being better than other people, right? That is an external or extrinsic thing. We made it a point not to say things like that, even to reject motivations like that explicitly. Improving yourself, right? Or competing against yourself. I think that's an internal motivation, an intrinsic one. Winning an award, that's external. Now, here's the tricky one: getting a B+ on homework or a test or a class. I think that depends. And Jen, I think you put it really well. It's relative to how hard did you work, right? I want to understand what you're understanding and not understanding, or what difficulties you're having with focus or other issues. If you tried really hard, then I'll praise that. I will probably try to help you understand what you didn't get, because someone thinks this is important for you to know about your future. So it can depend. And then finally, finding joy in poetry or painting or photography or something that is completely outside of academic, but just reflects the fact that God is the source of beauty. We are participating in that beauty. We grow in beauty as we are drawn out by Him towards these things. That is internal. All right. So I hope that makes sense. The next slide that I have here is educating kids. The contrast I think we've used is as missionaries versus as capitalist competitors. So early on, we really enjoyed all kinds of learning, nature videos too, and math drills too. Languages were a really good example of how we exposed our kids and thought of them as missionaries in training. So of course, they get exposed to English. We also exposed them to Mandarin. Unfortunately, I don't speak Mandarin, and Ming does, but we had them take Saturday classes, and then Spanish. They took Spanish in 8th grade through high school. I was really happy about that exposure, because I figured if they know these languages, most of the world is going to be open to them. If they take Arabic later, almost the whole world will be open to them. And I use that as an illustration because I think it's a helpful framework that leads to a balanced approach to lifelong learning. And I wanted to give one illustration about 6th grade, their respective 6th grade years, because we homeschooled our kids because there was this gap between Boston schools are a little complicated. So Ming took the subjects of math, science, and Chinese, and I took the subjects of ancient history, literature, and Bible. So this, I hope, illustrates kind of, again, educating kids to be missionaries or with that spirit. For history, I had them read Thomas Cahill's book, The Gifts of the Jews, which is high school level reading. He talks about circular stories like belief systems being either circular or linear. And circular stories are like Hinduism or Zoroastrianism, where good and evil just keep going around and around and it never ends. And you realize maybe they're the same thing or something, or good never triumphs over evil. So it's like watching a sad documentary. Linear stories are Judaism and Christianity and Islam as well, where good triumphs over evil. So then the questions, when we are in a story or watching a story like that, the questions are, who's the villain? Who's the hero? And which side are you on? And so in circular stories, like in Hinduism, more often you have to transcend the world. In Judaism and Christianity, you have to side with the hero and participate in the victory over evil, like the struggle over evil towards victory. And that story paradigm is actually the evangelism material that I've used in campus ministry at Harvard, Tufts, Boston College, and a bunch of other places. Now, for literature, I had them read The Life of Pi by Jan Martel and The Lord of the Flies by William Golding. I had them compare and contrast these books. Why is that? Because both stories are about shipwreck, survival, and salvation. Life of Pi is from a Hindu framework. The boy gets rescued. But does it really matter is the question at the end. And it uses the circular story framework. The Lord of the Flies is from a Judeo-Christian linear framework. The boys do get rescued, but by adult sailors on a Navy ship during wartime. So the question then is, who will save the adults? What does it mean to hope for a rescue, right? To hope for a salvation for ourselves and the world. And this story paradigm was really helpful. It helped my kids in their own faith struggles. My kids continue to talk about it with me now that they're in college. They have used it in conversation with their friends. And, the backdrop to that is important as well. And I think it's worth mentioning that I think one of the things we probably did best as parents was to expose our kids to epic stories and get them interested in epic stories like Chronicles of Narnia or The Hobbit or The Lord of the Rings. Our kids learned how to swear from the musical version of Les Miserables. I mean, we would talk regularly about why is the villain and why is the hero the hero? And it gives us a chance to develop this virtue ethics paradigm. Virtue ethics is where you try to do the good, the true, and the beautiful thing because we're becoming the good, true, and beautiful people in Christ, right? So courage is a virtue. It's important because courage is found in Jesus. Compassion and mercy are important because they are found in Jesus. And Jesus helps us become more and more like him. And so with the stories like that, I hope it's somewhat clear that, that we wanted to instill and develop and call forth those things in our kids. And so one thing for us to reflect on together is what kind of stories do we tell our children, or do we live in ourselves to remind ourselves? And there are, I think, really creative ways to honor a family member through a story, right? That it doesn't have to explicitly be about Christ, but because it is about a virtue, and that virtue ultimately points us to Jesus, that it becomes about him. He shines through it. So let's see. We're doing on time. Okay. Want to talk a little bit about then what kind of partnership have we experienced with our children? One of the areas that we've appreciated the most is caring for our parents, their grandparents. So two stories about that. When Ming's parents came to live with us for a few years back in 2015, Ming's mom had severe dementia by that point. And our, community, our Christian intentional community in our household was very supportive, and our kids were great partners to us. They helped us with meals. They helped change grandma's diapers. They asked how we were doing. They were present. They were emotionally present. And when Ming's mom finally passed, Zoe was in the bedroom. She noticed that grandma stopped breathing. It was a holy moment. And it just reflected our kids partnering with us in caring for them. They also partnered with us in caring for my mom. So my mom was not a Christian, and she passed away in October of 2022. And my kids challenged their grandma about a number of things. I mean, of course, they expressed appreciation, but they challenged her about her prejudice against Koreans and our neighbors and the way we live. They said, but we like this. They were with her. They were upfront with her about believing in Jesus, and they would explain to her how they would want to work in the field of climate change prevention and also climate justice. They told her they might not get married and might not have kids of their own. And my mom kind of complained to me about that, and it led to more conversations about how Her generation and before that separated personal success from caring for other people and the planet. And I think that was a luxury and a mistake of past generations. That is a part of the problem that Gen Z has to wrestle with now because, Gen X and boomers, we divided those things. They cannot. So those are some ways that we experienced partnership from our children in the kingdom.
We also asked both kids when they were teenagers how they would feel about our fostering, and it was with their buy-in that we decided to foster over the last 7, going on 8 years. Um, and also that's been an area that we've continued to call them into partnership, because in partnership into caring for one another, we've challenged them um, to partner with us to care for another sibling, and to continue to call out the things when they become challenging and hard. And that hasn't been straightforward, but it's been an area where we continue to call out and ask for partnership. Um, in our last category of speaking honestly, and vulnerably, of also going through disappointments as parents because we've given you some of our most, well, our treasured moments and our highest desires. We've also gone through hardships. Mako and I definitely prepared as much as we could spiritually and emotionally for our kids' teenage years because we all know that that's an unpredictable time, and you hope for the best and try to prepare for the things that can genuinely be hard that we may or may not go through. But we especially prepared because our oldest was a stubborn kid starting from babyhood, and made a sport of talking back starting from the age of 3, and he escalated it at the age of 12. And so all through, we really prepared for this time of teenagehood to practice all the values that Mako just talked about so that we could keep working on preparing the kids, inviting them into partnership with us, challenging them through the lens of character development, saying our value-based hopes, rolling with the punches, practicing patience, trying to take a step back, see the bigger arc of things, trying to consider with humility and vulnerability ourselves when we got challenged and critiqued, so that we could be better partners ourselves. So for us, when the talk back attitude part of things, especially for our oldest, who was the most talk backy attitude person up to that point, when it seemed to calm down, when he turned 16, 17, 18, we breathed a sigh of relief. And felt like we had gotten over the hard part, and we started looking forward to how it was going to be the next good, solid, not argumentative partnership, pure partnership parts of things. But then 2 years ago, when our son was 21, we actually started getting progressively harder and harder gut punches, from an existential set of crises that he was undergoing. He was transparent about some of it, with us, and that kind of continued some of the argumentative ways, that we had gotten used to when we would challenge him. But also during this time, he lied to us for significant parts of it, and went undercover with a few things, which we only progressively found out about, and which, of course, is among any parent, from any cultural background, any faith background. It's any parent's worst nightmares, and it certainly was ours as well. Um, 1 year ago, it culminated in a particularly grievous revelation. While our son was physically safe and hadn't engaged in anything criminal, it was a real gut punch. And in some ways, this kind of experience could make everything else we've talked about today um, ring hollow, and could feel like it would even disqualify us to be this kind of workshop speaker, especially to choose this topic. Um, a possibility that definitely went through my own mind was that maybe we've done all this completely wrong. Maybe we should have gone with the purely outcome-oriented, shame-based, more effective tiger parenting, maybe our child would have been felt too restricted by the high standards, and fear of shaming, and then maybe he wouldn't have gone through this existential anti-kingdom testing out of things. Another possibility, of course, was that our values-based parenting is a good model, but we severely screwed it up. And while our theory was good, we must have carried it out really poorly. And I'll just say, in the moment of this revelation, about a year ago, I'm so grateful for the gospel, period, and also so grateful for the gospel in Mako, because in the moment of revelation and confession, from our son, when we were both feeling completely gut punched, very sad, angry, um, Mako was able to put his forehead to John's, look him in the eyes with tears in his own, and at that point, John had tears in his eyes as well, and Mako was able to say, "I love you as much as I did on the day that you were born," and those were the words that came to him. And in that moment, it was clearly Jesus, who was speaking to us, in us. In that moment, Jesus was dealing with shame, in us as the parents. And it was Jesus in Mako that allowed him to speak that out, across shame, and to speak out the love and to call out love in our adult son. Um, in the past year, we've been really grateful for. We've thanked and affirmed our 21-year-old daughter, for continuing to be a partner with us in her growth and in rooting for the growth of her older brother. She's held a lot with us, as the one who seems to parallel the elder son in the story of the prodigal son more, the one who didn't leave home, but practiced partnership with us, in this case, not getting resentful and trying to kick her brother out of the family, but trying to stay in partnership with us and compassion with us as the parents, in our own grief, and continuing to cheer on her brother and pray for him and hope for him. And because our son has wanted our continued partnership and input because he invited it, we have continued to try to offer it to him in various ways as an adult kid, supporting him, looking for therapy, trying to understand himself with his mental and spiritual health issues, praying spiritual warfare prayers over him, offering Bible study, and hoping for rejoicing, because there has been rejoicing in the redemptive arc, and knowing the story's not over. Um, right now, we're in the thick of hoping, for more of that redemptive arc. Um, and with our foster daughter, who's 14 now, and it's more complicated because she comes from a different racial, cultural background from us. We're trying to offer her the best of what we have to offer from our cultural heritage and who we are, respecting and affirming hers. We're grateful in this case also to be in a community of friends, and trying to practice value-based parenting, through prayer, tears, longing, understanding her specific trauma, looking for opportunities for partnership whenever possible, practicing forgiveness, and saying sorry ourselves when necessary, and really looking to God for help, and mercy, and practicing what we preach. So we would also like to take a little time, for prayer before, I guess it's a little time for answers.
Q&A too.
Yeah, maybe. Okay, but I'll take a moment to, for us to pray. Lord, thank you for parenting us and reparenting us. Thank you that we are all, in the story of the prodigal son, and you are always the father with us, running out to greet us. Um, and this is a part of the story that in one way or another we, continue to relive with you, that in our hearts, our action, our thought, we are often, choosing our own way, and ending up feeding the pigs and needing to return. And it's a good thing for us to remember, and to come to our senses and to begin our return. But always you run out to greet us. And so we ask that you will continue to practice that, with each one of us individually, each one of us as we care for and love, whether it's our biological kids, whether it's folks that we are caring for and hoping for in faith, in whatever ways. Thank you that you're always, without shame, running out to restore us and greet us and to love us and to invite us into loving partnership with you. And we get to do the different parts of that redemption story over and over. Pray blessing over each person in your name. Amen.